At my own birthday dinner, my children raised their glasses and laughed. To the house we'll inherit. And in that moment, I realized they had already buried me alive. That sentence still burns in my ears, like glass shattering against the floor. I had imagined that evening as a celebration of endurance, of survival, of the years I had carried this family on my back. I had scrubbed floors until my knees swelled, worked night shifts when the city slept, saved pennies in jars that once held mayonnaise and peanut butter, all so I could keep a roof over our heads. That roof, this house, was supposed to be my crown. Yet as I sat at the head of the table, surrounded by the faces I brought into this world, what I heard was not love, not gratitude, not even respect. It was greed, sharpened into a toast, dressed up as humour, but heavy with the truth of how they saw me. Not as a living mother, but as an obstacle standing between them and their inheritance. The dining room glowed with warm light from the chandelier I bought 20 years ago at a flea market. I had polished the old wood floors until they shone like mirrors, and on the table sat the meal I had cooked myself. Roasted chicken with rosemary, mac, and cheese the way my mama taught me. Collard greens simmered low and slow, cornbread cooling in. Its cast-iron pan. It smelled of home, of years of tradition and struggle and survival. And for a few moments, as I set the plates and lit the candles, I fooled myself into believing it would be a night of togetherness. They arrived carrying flowers, still wrapped in plastic, store-bought pies with price tags stuck to the lids, and gift bags that jingled with perfume bottles and scarves I did not need. My oldest son kissed my cheek with a smile that did not touch his eyes. My daughter-in-law's heels clicked against the floor, as if every step was a performance, her compliments rehearsed, her eyes darting across the room, assessing. My younger daughter, dressed in a brand-new outfit I knew she could not afford without the cards I once co-signed, hugged me with the excitement of a woman who had something to prove rather than something to give. We sat, and I said grace, my voice carrying the same prayer my grandmother once whispered in a shack where the rain leaked through the roof. Lord, thank you for this food, for this roof, for the strength that kept me one more year. I opened my eyes, and they were already shifting in their seats, impatient, half listening, waiting for the part of the evening they cared about. They ate. They chatted about promotions, vacations, the newest gadgets, all things that had little to do with me, their words filling the room like static. I chewed my food slowly, listening, smiling when necessary, swallowing not just chicken and cornbread, but also the silence that lived between us, the unspoken truths about what they thought of me and what they wanted. Then came the moment. My son lifted his glass. The room fell quiet, and I braced myself for words of love or thanks. To Mama, he began, and for one brief second my chest swelled with pride. But then came the knife. And to the house we'll inherit. His voice rang out clear, and laughter followed like a wave, careless, sharp, echoing against the walls I had painted myself, bouncing around the photographs of birthdays and graduations, of Christmas mornings and first days of school. Even the grandchildren picked up the phrase, repeating it like a game, innocent of the cruelty in the words. I sat frozen, my fork suspended mid-air, my heart beating so hard I thought it would split my ribs. I wanted to scream, to flip the table, to remind them of every hour I worked with swollen feet and aching back so they could live in comfort. Instead, I placed my napkin gently on the table, rose to my feet, and walked toward the hallway. My purse hung on its hook. Inside it was the deed, creased, worn, and touched so many times that the paper itself carried my fingerprints like a second skin. I slipped it deeper into my bag, zipped it closed, and when I turned toward the door, I knew I was not just leaving dinner. I was leaving behind the illusion that my children still saw me as their mother, rather than as an asset waiting to be divided. They called after me. "Mama, it was just a joke. Don't be so sensitive. Come back and cut the cake." Their voices chased me down the hallway, but I did not stop. I opened the front door, and the cool night air rushed against my face, a reminder that the world outside still held freedom, still held dignity, still held breath that belonged only to me. The porch groaned beneath my steps, the same porch I had rebuilt when termites hollowed it out, the same boards where I had rocked in my chair on humid summer nights, whispering prayers to the God who never let me go hungry. Behind me, the laughter dimmed, replaced by confusion, irritation, whispers. Ahead of me stretched the quiet night, and in my purse, heavy and certain, lay the deed with my name. Every line on that paper was a record of my battle. The mortgage I had paid when the bank turned its back on me, the repairs I had covered when my paycheck was thin, the sweat, the bruises, the rejection letters, the prejudice, the double shifts, all pressed into ink and signatures that made one thing clear. This house was mine, and I would protect it, even if it meant standing against my own blood. That was the night the war began. The ride home that night was heavier than any journey I had ever taken, even heavier than the bus rides I used to endure after 12-hour shifts, cleaning downtown offices where men in suits would walk past me without even looking down. I drove slowly, the headlights cutting through the quiet suburban streets, every house I passed reminding me of the decades it had taken to secure my own. My children's laughter still echoed in my ears, sharp as broken glass, not fading even as I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. For years, I had told myself that my sacrifice would be repaid in respect, that even if they forgot the details of what I had given, they would remember the spirit of my labor. But as their voices rang in my memory, "To the house we'll inherit," I realized that in their eyes I had already been translated into numbers, into property, into a name on a deed they were waiting to erase. That realization did not just hurt. It rearranged something in me. When I parked in my driveway, I sat for a long time in the car with the engine off, staring at the home I had fought to protect. The porch light glowed softly, illuminating the cracks in the steps I had patched myself after the last storm. The same steps where my children once sat in Halloween costumes waiting to go trick-or-treating, their little legs swinging in excitement. The living room window glimmered faintly, revealing the silhouette of the rocking chair I had inherited from my mother, the one I used to nurse babies in, the one where I had fallen asleep countless nights holding them against my chest. To them, it was just a piece of furniture in a house they wanted to renovate. To me, it was a relic of love, of survival, of the quiet power of a black woman who had built her own sanctuary in a country that had tried to deny her one. I finally went inside, placed my purse on the table, and carefully pulled out the deed. The paper was creased and worn from being handled so often, the ink faded slightly, but the authority of those words was still strong. My name, signed and notarized. The proof that every brick, every nail, every patch of paint belonged to me, and no one else. I spread it on the kitchen table and laid my hand flat against it, as if to remind myself it was real. I remembered the day I first held that deed, standing outside the county office, tears streaming down my face because it was the first time anyone had officially recognized my ownership of something permanent, something no landlord or supervisor could snatch away. That house had been the one constant in a life of upheaval, and it was mine. Yet my children had dared to claim it with a joke that revealed their truest thoughts. I thought back to the path that had brought me here, how every choice I made was about ensuring they had stability, even when it meant stripping myself of rest or joy. I remembered walking home from the bus stop after midnight, my uniform stiff with sweat, my shoes worn to the bone, repeating to myself that the overtime hours would pay for their school supplies. I remembered the humiliation of being told by bank officers that women like me were high risk, and the bitter taste of signing loan papers with interest rates designed to keep me paying forever. I remembered the neighbours who whispered that I would never hold on to the house, that a single black woman raising children on her own was too fragile a foundation for permanence. But I had proved them wrong every month that I mailed a check, every year that I filed taxes, every time I fixed a leak with my own hands because I could not afford a plumber. And now my children, who had slept beneath this roof, who had eaten meals stretched out of pennies, who had worn clothes mended by my hands, thought of this house as their prize, their guarantee, their inheritance. It was not love that filled their voices that night. It was entitlement. Entitlement to something they had not worked for, something they had not bled for, something that had nearly destroyed me, but which I refused to let slip from my grip. That realization cut deeper than any insult they could have spoken to my face. It told me that the years I had spent feeding them, defending them, and protecting them had not taught them gratitude, but instead had trained them to believe they deserved everything I had. I walked from room to room that night, touching the walls, brushing my fingers across the photos that still hung in the hallway. There was one of my oldest son in his cap and gown, smiling wide on the day I thought my sacrifices had finally borne fruit. Another of my daughter at her 12th birthday, her cheeks puffed as she blew out candles on a cake I had baked after working a double shift. There were family pictures in church clothes, snapshots of Christmas mornings when the tree barely had anything beneath it, but their joy made it seem full. I had preserved these memories in frames as if they could anchor us, as if they could keep my children tied to me by something stronger than blood. But that toast had shattered the illusion, and as I stood in the hallway, I realized that the house itself was not just wood and brick. It was a symbol of my life's work, and it was under threat from the very people I had built it for. By the time I returned to the kitchen, the decision had crystallized in me. I would no longer wait silently for them to circle like vultures, picking apart my home as if I were already gone. I would take every step necessary to protect what was mine, not just for the sake of keeping a roof over my head, but for the sake of preserving my dignity. I would meet with the bank again. I would revisit the notary. I would reorganize my will, and I would ensure that no one, no child, no in-law, no lawyer they dragged into this, could ever strip from me what I had bled to build. For too long, I had avoided hard confrontations, convincing myself that silence kept peace. But silence had not brought me peace that evening. It had brought me humiliation. The catalyst was not just their laughter. It was the realization that if I did not act now, they would continue to chip away at me until nothing was left but a shell waiting to die. I poured myself a glass of water and sat once more at the table with the deed before me, tracing the letters of my name with a fingertip. They wanted this house as an inheritance. But I was not dead. I was not weak. And I was not done fighting. 2 days after that dinner, when the sting of their laughter still pulsed in my ears, the knock came at my door. It was not the polite kind of knock that waits patiently for permission. It was the heavy, insistent kind that announces itself like a demand. I opened it to find my oldest son standing there with his wife at his side, both of them dressed in casual clothes, but carrying the same air of authority they always put on when they wanted something. My son smiled faintly, but the smile did not reach his eyes, and his wife clutched a glossy catalogue as if she were holding evidence. They did not wait for an invitation. They stepped inside as if the house already belonged to them, their shoes tapping against the floorboards I had scrubbed only the night before. They walked directly into the living room, spreading out like surveyors studying a plot of land. His wife flipped open the catalogue, its pages filled with images of expensive sofas, marble countertops, and sleek light fixtures, none of which resembled the warm, lived-in furniture that filled my home. She placed it on the coffee table and slid it toward me with a polished smile. "We've been thinking," she began, her tone rehearsed and sugary, "about how this house could really shine with just a little renovation, a modern kitchen, some fresh flooring, maybe opening up this wall to make it more spacious." My son chimed in, his voice deeper, firmer, carrying the weight of assumption. "Yeah, Mama, this place is too big for you alone anyway. Wouldn't it be nice if it was fixed up for the future? For us to raise our kids in after you're, you know, ready to rest?" The words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and acrid. Too big for me alone. Fixed up for their future, after I'm ready to rest. It was not just the disrespect of dismissing me while I stood before them alive and breathing. It was the cold calculation in their eyes, the certainty that I would hand over not only the keys to the house, but the dignity of my survival. They spoke of renovations as if my life were already finished, as if the walls that held my laughter, my tears, my memories, could be gutted and replaced with open concept emptiness that erased all traces of me. I did not argue. I did not shout. I walked to the bookshelf in the corner where I kept a worn folder of documents, pulled it out, and laid it flat on the coffee table beside their glossy catalogue. The folder was thick, stuffed with years of receipts, utility bills, tax records, insurance statements, and at the very front, the deed itself. I opened it slowly, letting the sound of the paper echo in the quiet room. "This is what makes this house shine," I said evenly. "Not marble countertops, not fancy furniture. This, my name, my payments, my work, every month, every year. You see this? This house is mine, paid for, protected, not waiting for anyone to inherit while I'm standing here alive." For a moment, silence stretched between us, broken only by the rustle of my daughter-in-law flipping her glossy catalogue closed, her manicured nails tapping against its cover with irritation. My son cleared his throat and tried to soften his tone, but the edge of annoyance crept through. "Mama, we're not saying it's not yours. Of course, it's yours right now. But you have to think about the future. You can't live here forever. Houses need upkeep, repairs, care. It's not realistic for you to handle all that by yourself. We're just trying to plan ahead, make things easier." His words came dressed as concern, but I could hear the greed humming underneath like a bass note that never stopped. I looked at them both, at their polished clothes and restless energy, and I remembered the years when they were small, when I worked double shifts to make sure they had new shoes for school, when I skipped meals so their bellies would be full, when I cried in silence after receiving another bank notice, but still managed to put food on the table. I remembered buying this house with nothing but determination and the faith that God would not abandon me, patching leaks with my own 2 hands, mowing the lawn in the heat of July, painting walls until my arms ached. And here they were, standing in the middle of all that labor, telling me it was too much for me now, that it was time to hand it over to them. I gathered the papers back into the folder, closed it with deliberate calm, and held it tightly against my chest. "This house has been too much for me since the day I bought it," I said slowly, "and yet every month I found a way. Don't tell me what I can't do. Don't come in here with catalogues and plans as if my life is already done. I'm still here. I'm not resting. I'm not retiring. And I'm not giving you anything just because you think it's your turn. My turn never ended. They stared at me, shocked not by the words, but by the force behind them. My son opened his mouth to argue again, but I lifted my hand, silencing him. I don't need your renovations. I don't need your plans. And I don't need you standing in my living room talking about what you'll inherit while I'm alive. If you can't respect me, then you can leave. The tension snapped like a rope pulled too tight. My daughter-in-law scoffed, muttering under her breath about how ungrateful I was, how they were just trying to help. My son looked at me with the frustrated eyes of a man who believed his patience had been tested by the very woman who gave him life. They left without another word, the slam of the door rattling the windows, their footsteps crunching angrily down the walkway. I stood in the silence they left behind, my hands still clutching the folder, my chest heaving with a mixture of rage and sorrow. That was the first escalation. Not a scream, not a blow, but a battle of intentions. They had shown me their hunger more openly than ever before, no longer hiding behind jokes or toasts. And I had shown them mine. Not hunger, but resolve. I knew they would not stop there. I knew they would regroup, plan another way to pry this house from my hands. But I also knew that something in me had shifted forever. The illusion that silence was safer, that avoiding conflict would preserve peace, had shattered. The only way to survive now was to fight openly, with documents, with strategy, with the truth of what I had earned and the refusal to let it be stolen. That night, I sat again at the kitchen table, the folder spread before me like armor. I went through every paper, every receipt, every signature, organizing them into neat stacks. I remembered where each bill came from, the months when money was so tight I had to choose between keeping the lights on and buying new shoes for my children. I remembered pawning jewelry for one mortgage payment, then working overtime to buy it back. I remembered the years when the roof leaked and I climbed up myself with tar and nails because I could not afford a repairman. Each paper was not just a record of ownership, it was a record of resilience, proof that I had built something out of nothing and refused to let it crumble. By the time dawn touched the horizon, my decision was clear. If my children wanted to escalate their claims, then I would escalate my defenses. I would not just rely on memory or emotion. I would prepare. I would make sure the deed was updated, the will rewritten, the protections sealed tighter than their schemes. They thought I was a woman too old, too tired, too weak to fight. But they had forgotten that I had been fighting my whole life, against poverty, against discrimination, against systems designed to keep women like me at the bottom. If I could win those battles, I could win this one. The first escalation had come, and so had my answer. I would not yield. The morning I walked into the notary's office, the sun was bright, but the air still carried that faint chill that seeps into your bones after a long winter. I held my bag tightly against me, the same bag that had carried the deed home from county offices decades earlier, the same bag I clutched like armor on the night I left my birthday dinner. The building was modest, set back from the street with blinds drawn half closed against the glare, but inside it smelled of fresh coffee and paper, a strange mix of comfort and bureaucracy. The receptionist, a young woman with braids tied neatly into a bun, greeted me politely, and for a moment I caught myself thinking of my younger self, walking into offices where no one ever looked me in the eye, where I was addressed as "ma'am" only, with a tone that carried doubt about my worth. Here, at least, I was being acknowledged, and that mattered more than I expected. The notary, a middle-aged black woman named Denise, wore glasses perched low on her nose, and had the kind of steady presence that instantly settled my nerves. She invited me into her office, stacked with folders and framed certificates, and asked in a calm voice how she could help. I set the folder of documents on her desk and smoothed the papers with trembling hands, the deed resting at the top like a crown. "I need to update my will," I said quietly, though the words carried the weight of years. "I need to make sure that when the time comes, this house goes where I decide, not where someone else thinks it should." Denise nodded slowly, not rushing me, not interrupting, just letting me gather the pieces of my story. I told her about my children, about the dinner toast that had cut me open, about the visit 2 days later with catalogues and talk of renovations. I told her how the house was not just property, but proof of survival, a place I had paid for with years of labour and sacrifice, a place that held the only kind of permanence life had ever given me. My voice broke when I described the way my son's eyes had gleamed when he spoke of inheriting it, as if I were already gone, as if the walls could be gutted without mourning, as if my existence were nothing more than a delay in their plans. She listened with that deep patience that comes from knowing too well how stories like mine repeat, not always in the same details, but in the same patterns of exploitation, dismissal, and betrayal. When I finished, she adjusted her glasses and leaned forward. "You're not the first mother who's had to protect herself from her own blood," she said softly, "and you won't be the last. But you came here, and that means you've already taken back the power they thought you'd never claim." Her words were both balm and blade, soothing me while also cutting through the last of my hesitation. Together, we went over the options. I could rewrite the will, naming beneficiaries outside my immediate family if I chose. I could create a trust that would tie the house to my intentions so tightly no greedy hand could pry it loose. I could even dedicate it to a cause that mattered to me, one that would transform my life's work into shelter and hope for women who had walked the same road of exhaustion and invisibility. As she spoke, I felt something inside me shift from defensive to deliberate. It was no longer only about keeping the house from being stolen. It was about defining what my house would mean when I was gone. I thought of all the women I had known who had lost everything to sons, daughters, or in-laws who believed they had the right to take, who saw their mothers not as people, but as banks with fading faces. I thought of women I had worked beside in the factory, in offices, in kitchens, who had died without dignity because they trusted family members who turned into predators. I thought of my own mother, who never owned a home but poured her labour into keeping a roof over our heads, and who died knowing she had little to leave behind but her strength. I realised that my house could be more than a tombstone of survival. It could be a weapon against the very patterns that had sought to diminish me. So I made the decision, sitting there at Denise's desk with the afternoon sun slanting through the blinds. I rewrote my will so that the house would not pass into the hands of my children, who saw it only as inheritance. Instead, it would go to a local foundation that provided housing and legal support for women escaping abuse, many of them black women of my generation and younger, who carried scars both visible and hidden. Denise nodded approvingly as I signed the papers, her steady hand guiding mine through the legal lines, her notary stamp pressing firmly onto the page with a sound that felt like a gavel declaring victory. When it was done, I sat back and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. For the first time in weeks, maybe in years, I felt a kind of weight slide off my shoulders. I was no longer waiting to be robbed. I had secured myself. My children could come with their jokes, their catalogues, their claims of concern, but they could not touch what I had just done. The law, the same system that had denied me loans and dismissed my worth, was now bound to me because I had used it in my favour. The papers in front of me were more than ink and signatures. They were a shield. When I left the office, the sky had turned golden with late afternoon light, and the city hummed with traffic and voices. I walked down the street with the new folder pressed to my chest, the updated will tucked inside, and for the first time in a long time, I felt taller. I remembered walking these same streets decades ago, broke and exhausted, praying that one day I would hold something permanent in my hands. That day had come when I first bought the house, and now it had come again, not in buying, but in protecting. Still, as I drove home, I knew this was only the midpoint of the battle. My children would not simply shrug and walk away when they discovered the truth. They would rage, they would scheme, they would find new ways to try to corner me, because entitlement rarely dies quietly. But I also knew that I had shifted the balance. I was no longer the passive mother waiting for respect that never came. I was an active force shaping the outcome, and for the first time in a long time, I trusted my own strength more than their demands. That night, I sat on the porch as the sun slipped down and the streetlights flickered on. I listened to the sound of crickets in the grass, the distant hum of cars, the occasional bark of a dog. My house stood around me like a fortress, each board and nail reminding me of what I had done. I thought of the foundation that would one day inherit it, of the women who would walk through its doors, not to renovate away its history, but to add their own stories of survival. For once, the idea of the future did not fill me with dread, but with a kind of cautious hope. The midpoint was not an ending. It was a turn in the road, a place where I finally lifted my head and saw that I had options. My children had made me feel small at that dinner table, like a woman already buried. But sitting with those papers signed and sealed, I realized that I was still here, unburied, unbroken, and prepared. The fight was far from over, but it was no longer one-sided. And in that knowledge, I found strength. The letter arrived folded neatly in a cream envelope, with my name typed across the front in stiff block letters. Not the handwriting of family, not the friendly script of neighbours, but the mechanical precision of a law office. I knew before I even opened it that it was not good news. The air in the room seemed to tighten as I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out the crisp document, lines of legal language swimming across the page. My son and his wife had filed a petition in court, claiming that I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, that I was confused, forgetful, and in need of guardianship. They were asking a judge to strip me of my independence, to hand them control not only of the house, but of every decision I could make about my life. I sat at the kitchen table with that letter trembling in my hand, rage and disbelief boiling together until I could hardly breathe. Confused? Forgetful? These were the same children who still called me when their taxes baffled them, when they could not make sense of mortgage rates, when they needed someone to babysit at the last minute. Suddenly, I was incompetent because I had dared to protect what was mine. The cruelty of it made my stomach clench, but the betrayal carved deeper still. They were not content to joke about my death or plan renovations while I lived. They were now willing to drag me into court, to paint me as a senile old woman in order to steal from me in broad daylight. Memories crowded in, uninvited, but sharp. I saw myself standing in line at the bank years ago, refused a loan because my wages were too low, because I was black, because I was a single mother. I remembered the humiliation of walking home afterward, determined to keep saving until I could prove them wrong. I saw myself bent over mops and brooms, my hands cracked from bleach, my back screaming, my only thought that my children would never have to fight as hard as I did. Now those same children had turned around and declared me unfit, using the same kind of language the system once used against me. Only this time, it came not from strangers in suits, but from the mouths of my own blood. The days that followed were heavy. I heard whispers from neighbours who had seen my son's car parked outside late into the night, who asked politely if everything was all right. I watched my phone fill with missed calls and text messages from my children, all of them cloaked in fake concern. "Mama, you don't have to make this hard. We're just trying to help you. You know you can't handle this house forever." Every word felt like a dagger wrapped in sweetness, designed to pierce without leaving blood on their hands. I met with a lawyer of my own, a young woman with fierce eyes who listened carefully as I explained. She told me calmly that cases like this were more common than people realized, that children often tried to prove their parents unfit in order to gain control of assets. She explained that the court would look at my financial records, my bills, my ability to manage my home, and that evidence of my stability would be critical. As she spoke, I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the ground under my feet had shifted. I had thought signing the will at the notary was enough. I had believed securing the papers would shield me, but now I saw the depth of their determination. They were willing to put me on trial as if I were a criminal, as if my only crime was surviving long enough to keep what belonged to me. That night, I could not sleep. I walked the halls of my house, touching the walls as if to remind them and myself that I was still here, still strong, still capable. In the living room, I stood before the rocking chair that had soothed me through endless nights with babies in my arms. I thought of my mother, of the women before her, none of whom had been allowed to own property in their time, all of whom had been denied the respect of being seen as capable decision-makers. Their strength ran through my veins, and I knew I had to carry it into that courtroom. The injustice of it sat heavy in my chest, but beneath it grew a fire. They thought they could use the law to strip me bare, but I had spent a lifetime navigating systems designed to erase me. I would not crumble now. I gathered every receipt, every tax form, every utility bill, and stacked them neatly in folders. I called my bank to request statements proving my on-time mortgage payments. I even visited my doctor to obtain a certificate affirming my mental clarity and physical ability to manage my life. Each paper became a weapon, each signature a shield. Still, the ache of betrayal never left. No matter how many documents I prepared, I could not erase the image of my children sitting with a lawyer, signing their names to petitions that declared me incompetent. That cut deeper than any wound I had ever suffered, deeper than the insults of strangers, deeper than the slights of supervisors. Blood had turned against blood, and there was no undoing it. By the time the court date approached, I was no longer trembling. I was steady, not because the pain had lessened, but because I had transformed it into resolve. They had turned the fight into something larger than inheritance. It was no longer about who would own the house one day. It was about whether I was allowed to stand as a whole woman, capable, dignified, and alive. That was the cruel twist, the unfair turn of fate, that I, who had given everything to raise them, now had to defend my very sanity against them. And as unfair as it was, I knew I would not bow. I would walk into that courtroom with my head high, carrying the weight of my past, the proof of my present, and the determination that no one, child or stranger, would erase me while I still had breath. The week before the hearing, my home became a fortress of paper and memory. Every surface covered with files, letters, photographs, and receipts that stretched back through decades of my life. I had always been meticulous, keeping things organized in boxes labeled with dates and years, a habit born from necessity when banks questioned every move I made and landlords once threatened eviction without reason. Now those habits became my lifeline. I sat at the dining table where so many family meals had been shared and spread out the proof of my existence. Every bill paid, every mortgage statement stamped, every insurance policy renewed. My lawyer told me that in cases like mine, the details mattered more than emotion, that the judge would want to see evidence of competence, not just hear declarations of strength. So I dug deep into the archives of my life, reconstructing the story of a woman who had carried her household alone and had never once failed to meet her responsibilities. The weight of betrayal never left me, but the act of gathering evidence gave me purpose. Each document I touched brought back a memory. The year I finally paid off the last of the mortgage and walked into the bank with my head high. The night I stayed up until dawn, sewing my daughter's prom dress after a seamstress quoted a price I could never afford. The utility bills paid on time, even when my paycheck was stretched so thin I sometimes ate nothing but rice and beans for a week. I stacked those papers carefully, labeling them with sticky notes so the lawyer could present them clearly. They were not just documents. They were fragments of my dignity made visible on the page. It was during those long nights of preparation that my neighbor, Mrs. Harris, knocked softly on my door. She had lived 2 houses down for as long as I could remember, a widow who kept her garden blooming even in dry summers, a woman with sharp eyes and a gentle voice. When I opened the door, she carried a thermos of tea and a hesitant expression. "I've been hearing things," she said quietly. "I don't mean to intrude, but I think you ought to know." We sat at the kitchen table, and she told me how she had overheard my son and daughter-in-law talking in their car late at night, their voices sharp through the thin summer air. They had not realized her bedroom window was cracked open. "They were planning," she said, her eyes narrowing, "talking about how to convince the court you weren't fit, how they could use your age and any small mistake against you. They even laughed about how easy it would be, how judges usually side with the younger generation." My hands tightened around the cup she offered me, the steam curling into the air between us. "Mrs." Harris leaned closer and whispered. "I recorded some of it on my phone. I didn't know if I should, but something in me told me you might need it." She slid the phone across the table, and when I pressed play, my heart clenched at the sound of my children's voices, cold and calculating. My son said, "All we have to do is make her sound confused. She misplaces things all the time. That'll be enough." His wife replied with a laugh. "Once we get control, we can sell the place, flip it, and finally move out of this neighborhood." The cruelty of those words cut deeper than any insult, but the recording was undeniable proof of their intentions. It was the weapon I had not expected, delivered by a neighbor who refused to look away. I thanked her with tears burning in my eyes, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Don't let them make you small," she said. "You're stronger than they know." Her presence, her simple act of solidarity, reminded me that while my children might have turned against me, I was not entirely alone. Community mattered, and sometimes the people who stood by you were not the ones you birthed, but the ones who chose to see your worth. Armed with both documents and the recording, I met with my lawyer again. She listened intently, her expression hardening as she heard the voices on the tape. "This changes everything," she said. "They wanted to frame you as incompetent, but this shows malicious intent. It shows they are not acting out of concern, but greed." We strategized late into the evening, mapping out how the evidence would be presented, how my testimony would be structured, how every piece of paper and every word on that recording would come together to form a shield around me. I realized then that the hearing would not just be about my capability, it would be a stage where the truth of who they had become would be revealed. The tension grew as the date drew nearer. My phone continued to buzz with messages from my children, their tones swinging between pleading and threatening. One moment they wrote, "Mama, we love you," Just trust us. The next, if you fight us, you'll only embarrass yourself in front of everyone. I stopped answering altogether, focusing instead on the stacks of evidence, on the preparation that gave me strength. At night, I still walked the halls of my home, but now I did so with a steadier heart. Each room reminded me of the years I had survived, of the resilience that no court could erase. The day before the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection carefully. I saw the lines etched by years of labor, the silver in my hair, the weight in my shoulders. But I also saw clarity in my eyes, a steadiness that had carried me through storms fiercer than this. I chose a simple dress, pressed and neat, and laid it out for the morning. I packed the folders into a sturdy bag, checked the recording twice to make sure it played clearly, and set everything by the door. My house felt calm around me, as if it knew the battle was coming and was lending me its strength. That night, sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep. I dreamed of my mother's voice, soft but firm, telling me, "You are not weak. You are not confused. You are the woman who built this." When I woke with the dawn, the sky painted in shades of rose and gold, I felt ready. The fight had escalated beyond family arguments, beyond whispered threats. It had become a war of truth against lies, of survival against betrayal. My children thought the courtroom would be their weapon, but with my evidence, my neighbor's recording, and my unbroken will, I knew it could just as easily become their undoing. I left my house that morning with the bag slung over my shoulder, the door closing softly behind me. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it, and for a moment I paused, breathing in the scent of my own yard, the earth, the faint perfume of roses blooming in the garden. I whispered a promise to myself. I would not let them win. I would not let them erase me. This house was more than walls and floors. It was my legacy, my proof, my life. And I was prepared to defend it with everything I had. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that clings to buildings where decisions about people's lives are made every day, often without those people having the chance to truly speak. As I walked through the metal detectors and into the lobby, clutching the heavy bag of documents and the phone that held the recording, I felt every eye glance at me, then slide away, the way strangers often look at an older black woman moving with quiet determination. My lawyer walked beside me, her heels clicking on the tiled floor, her face set in a mask of calm confidence that I tried to borrow as my own. My hands trembled slightly as I tightened my grip on the strap of my bag. But my heart beat steady, fueled not by fear, but by the certainty that this was the moment everything would be decided. When we entered the courtroom, my children were already there, sitting at the opposite table with their lawyer, a man in an expensive suit whose smile seemed rehearsed, his hands folded neatly in front of him. My son avoided my eyes, staring at the table as if ashamed, though I knew it was not shame but calculation that made him refuse to meet my gaze. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, sat upright, her expression sharpened into something almost smug, as though she believed victory was already hers. Seeing them together like that, aligned not as family but as adversaries, made something tighten in my chest. But I straightened my shoulders and took my seat. The judge entered, a tall woman with silver hair and a gaze that swept the room with quiet authority. Everyone stood, then sat again, and the proceedings began. My children's lawyer spoke first, his voice smooth and practiced, painting me as a woman slipping into confusion, a mother who no longer understood her own finances, a homeowner incapable of maintaining her property. He spoke of age, of concerns, of how my children only wanted to protect me. Each word dripped with false compassion, but underneath it, pulsed the same greed I had heard in their laughter at my birthday dinner. He submitted statements they had written, anecdotes twisted into stories of forgetfulness, all carefully chosen to build the image of incompetence. As he spoke, I kept my eyes on the judge, not allowing myself to flinch, not even when my daughter-in-law dabbed at her eyes with a tissue as though this were a tragedy for her. My lawyer leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay steady. Our turn is coming." And when it came, I felt the room shift. My lawyer rose and began by laying out the documents, each one a brick in the fortress I had built. Mortgage statements showing decades of payments made on time, utility bills with no arrears, tax filings accurate and complete, medical records confirming my health. She spoke not with the polished charm of their attorney, but with precision, letting the facts speak louder than any performance. She called me to the stand, and when I stood, my legs felt heavy for a moment. But as I reached the witness chair, a strange calm washed over me. The lawyer asked me simple questions first. My name, my age, my occupation over the years. I spoke clearly, each word measured, my voice carrying the weight of years spent silenced and underestimated. She then guided me to speak of my responsibilities, of the bills I had paid, of the repairs I had overseen, of the ways I had managed my home and life without fail. As I spoke, I saw the judge's eyes on me, steady and attentive, and I realized that this was my chance not just to defend myself, but to reclaim the narrative my children had twisted. Then came the moment that would turn the entire case. My lawyer asked me if I had any evidence of my children's intentions, and I nodded. From my bag, I pulled the phone Mrs. Harris had given me and handed it to her. She connected it to the court's audio system, and as the recording played, the room grew still. My son's voice filled the space, cold and deliberate. All we have to do is make her sound confused. She misplaces things all the time. That'll be enough. Then came my daughter-in-law's laugh, sharp and cruel. Once we get control, we can sell the place, flip it, and finally move out of this neighborhood. The words hung in the courtroom like a poisonous fog. The judge's expression did not change, but I saw her eyes harden, and I saw the faint tremor that passed across my son's face as he finally looked up, caught in the sound of his own betrayal. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, her smugness cracking, her lips pressed into a thin line. Their lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled him, saying, "The recording is admissible. Proceed." My lawyer asked me then, softly but firmly, why I had taken the steps to protect my house. I looked directly at the judge, my voice steady, though my hands gripped the arms of the chair. Because I am not confused. I am not incompetent. I am a woman who worked her whole life to build something from nothing, and I will not allow my children to take it from me while I'm still alive. This house is not just property. It is the roof that sheltered them, the walls that heard their laughter and their cries, the proof of every hour I worked when the world said I would fail. I have managed it alone for decades, and I am still managing it today. They are not protecting me. They are trying to erase me. For a moment, silence filled the room, the kind of silence that follows truth spoken without apology. I felt the weight lift from my shoulders, as though the act of saying it aloud had freed me, even if nothing else came from it. My lawyer thanked me and allowed me to step down, and as I walked back to my seat, I held my head high. The rest of the proceedings passed in a blur, arguments from their side unraveling, attempts to defend themselves drowned out by the clarity of the recording and the mountain of documents we had presented. When the judge finally spoke, her voice was firm. She declared that there was no evidence of incompetence, no reason to grant guardianship, and she warned my children sharply about the dangers of abusing the court system for personal gain. Her gavel struck the sound block with a sharp crack that echoed through the room, sealing the decision. I did not smile, not even as my lawyer touched my shoulder in quiet triumph. My children sat frozen, their faces pale, their plans collapsed in front of everyone. I stood slowly, collected my bag, and walked toward the exit. The hallway outside felt brighter, the air lighter, as though I had stepped out from under a storm cloud. Yet I knew the scars of that moment would remain. I had won, yes, but the victory came at the cost of the illusion that my children still loved me unconditionally. Still, as I walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, the weight of the folder in my bag reminded me that I had done more than defend myself. I had proven that I was not invisible, not disposable, not the confused woman they had tried to paint me as. I was whole, I was capable, and I had forced the truth into the open where no one could deny it. That was the climax, not just of the case, but of the years of silence I had endured. I had spoken, I had fought, and I had not been erased. When the courthouse doors closed behind me, and the sound of my lawyer's heels faded down the stone steps, I stood still for a long moment, letting the sunlight wash over me like a baptism. The air carried the faint smell of car exhaust and blooming magnolias, a sharp contrast to the stale weight of the courtroom. I felt lighter, though not because the pain of betrayal had vanished. It hadn't, and maybe it never would. But because I had proven, not just to the judge or to my children, but to myself, that I was still whole, still capable, still here. The papers in my bag were no longer just defenses against attack. They were symbols of victory, testimony that I had not allowed myself to be erased. When I walked back into my house that evening, the late sun slanted through the windows, filling the living room with gold. I set the bag down on the dining table, the same table where my children once did their homework while I cooked dinner, the same table where, just weeks ago, they had raised their glasses to my supposed inheritance. This time the house felt different. The walls that had absorbed my tears and my worries now seemed to hum with quiet pride. I ran my hand over the back of the rocking chair by the window, the one my mother had left me, and whispered a thank you to her, as if she could hear. It was her strength, and the strength of all the women before me, that had carried me to this moment. Word of the court case spread quickly through the neighborhood. Shock. Harris stopped by the next day with a plate of cornbread and a smile of satisfaction. "I knew you'd stand tall," she said, her voice warm with pride. The ladies from church called too, their voices rising with both shock and admiration when I told them what had happened. Some confessed their own fears, their own struggles with children or relatives who circled like hawks when property or money was involved. I realized then that my battle was not only mine. It belonged to so many women of my age, especially black women, who had fought their way into ownership only to discover that the hardest part was keeping it safe from the very people they had sacrificed for. My children did not come by in the days that followed. Their silence was louder than any apology, but I did not chase after them. I had spent too many years bending myself into forgiveness before it was earned, softening the truth so they would feel comfortable. This time, I let the silence stand. If they wanted to see me, they would have to come not as heirs in waiting, but as children willing to face the harm they had caused. Until then, my door remained closed. Instead of dwelling on them, I turned my focus outward. I called the foundation I had named in my will and told them what had happened, not in every painful detail, but enough to let them know why my decision mattered so deeply. The woman on the other end of the line thanked me with a voice trembling with emotion. She told me that my gift would one day house women fleeing violence, women who needed a safe place to begin again. Hearing that, I felt something crack open in me, a release of bitterness replaced by the knowledge that my house would not just survive me, it would protect others. That gave me peace, in a way even victory in court could not. Life began to take on a new rhythm. I still woke early, brewed my coffee, and sat on the porch as the sun rose. But now I sat with a lighter heart. I pulled weeds from the garden, repainted the porch rails, and even started a journal where I wrote down everything I had endured, not just for myself, but for the women who might one day need to know that they too could fight and win. My story was not polished or easy, but it was real, and I wanted it recorded so no one could ever pretend it hadn't happened. One afternoon, as I watered the flowers out front, I noticed a car slow down near the house. My son was in the passenger seat, his wife driving, their faces pale behind the windshield. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw the flicker of shame, or maybe anger. It was hard to tell. They didn't stop. The car rolled on, turning the corner, disappearing down the street. I stood there, the hose dripping water onto the soil, and felt no rush of longing, no ache to call them back. Whatever they carried now was theirs to reckon with. What I carried was my freedom. The house at my back seemed to stand taller, as if it too had survived a trial. Its bricks and boards had been threatened with erasure, but now they held a story of endurance that no one could deny. I stepped onto the porch, turned off the hose, and looked across the yard where my children once played tag, where laughter used to rise into the warm summer evenings. The memories were still there, but they no longer chained me. They were part of the story, not the whole of it. That night, as I closed the curtains and prepared for bed, I paused in the hallway and looked at the photos still hanging there. I saw the little boy in a graduation cap, the young girl blowing out candles, the family lined up in church clothes. I touched the frames gently, not to erase them, but to accept them for what they were. Moments of love, even if the future had twisted into betrayal. I could hold those memories without letting them rule me. Lying in bed, the house quiet around me, I realized that my journey had come full circle, from the humiliation of that birthday dinner, to the rage that fueled my preparation, to the battle in the courtroom, to this quiet evening of peace. I had walked through fire and come out whole. The betrayal of my children would always hurt, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was my choice to fight, my refusal to be erased, and the knowledge that the legacy I left behind would shelter not greed, but survival. I drifted to sleep with the window open, the night breeze carrying the faint sound of crickets. For the first time in a long time, I slept without fear, knowing that my house was safe, my dignity intact, and my story written not in whispers, but in strength. My children had tried to claim my home as their inheritance, but I had walked out with the deed in my hand and the truth in my voice. And that, more than anything, was my victory.